Okay, let's talk about the Gospel of Mark. As you can remember, we're talking and we're starting out with the assumption that Mark is the earliest gospel written. But so, how do we get here? Who's this Mark that we're talking about? Let's start there. Now, it's clear that the gospel, when it was originally written, was anonymous. The name was not attached to it, but we find that the names of these gospels are the names of the authors are very quickly and widely circulated, and they're attached to them in a very early point in time. So, Kata Markan, according to Mark, the gospel according to Mark, was pulled in pretty early. Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, in about 130 A.D., he's later recorded in Eusebius a couple centuries later. Papias says Mark became Peter's interpreter, exactly how we understand that. He wrote what he remembered, not in chronological order. So, there are three things we can say here when we name this. One, we know that it's a man named Mark. Two, we understand he's relying on Peter. And three, that Papias tells us he didn't write not in order or not chronologically. So that's what we've got going on in the Gospel of Mark. So then the question is, who is this man named Mark who relied on Peter? The reality is there's really only one who we can say with any definitives we would know, and that's John Mark. We see him in Acts 12:12, 12:25, 13:5, 13:13, 15:37, Philemon 24, 2 Timothy 4:11, and 1 Peter 5:7. And so this Mark would be the John Mark who, when Paul and Barnabas look at go on the second missionary journey, they have this falling out over this guy. Now we find later that John Mark has grown and he is faithful in the gospel. And so later on, Paul would come to have great affinity for John Mark. But he's really the only one we have here that would fit this bill. If it's not John Mark, there's no other Mark who would have a sufficient standing for us to know who this is. So that's who we're talking about. But when did he write? Well, this is a great question because we have dates ranging from sometime in the 40s to all the way to sometime in the 70s. All right, so that's a pretty substantial range. Now, what we want to understand is, again, assuming Markan priority, we're going to have to say Mark composed his gospel in time for Luke and Matthew to borrow it. Now, Matthew's going to be a little later, but at least for Luke. And we'll date Luke's gospel around AD 61-ish, 60, 61, somewhere in there. So it's going to have to be in there. But let's just talk about the issues we have. Sometimes you'll get scholars who say Mark wrote in the 40s. Now, there's some papyrological and historiographical information in there. Some have claimed that there are some issues that we could say and pull out and some connections. The problem is, if Mark's gospel is this early, these other New Testament writings, why are they not mentioning Mark? Why does it not show up anywhere? And that's an issue. When we deal with sometime in the 50s, now there's something more to commend this, specifically in the late 50s. If we know that Peter is in Rome in the mid to late 50s, and if we're basing a time on giving enough time for Luke to use Mark as a source, time in the late 50s sounds really good, kind of fits within that. Again, when we get to the 60s, tradition favors a date that's actually after Peter's death. However, this tradition is not widespread or common there. And so others will point to the fact, well, there's persecution. Then there was persecution going on in the 60s, so that we have a thing there. Well, the problem is, you read the book of Acts, persecution was not confined to the 60s. We know that the early church faced persecution almost consistently. And then we can say, some people say all the way up into the 70s later in that time. And it reflects an experience to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, there's nothing in there to say that any of those dates are there. For us, for our kind of understanding, it makes sense that sometime in the mid to late 50s, this would be a good time. It sounds about right for what Mark said. We don't have anything definitive to go on. But again, kind of building out historically, we know if Luke is writing and we can sort of date his little thing, we know it has to be before that if he's going to use it. So where does he write? Where is he writing from? Rome is the one. Rome is kind of the traditional understanding. And it's one that I hold to here. We do get Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria kind of pointing us in this direction. Now, there are a couple of things, and these are all circumstantial that point to Rome. None of these, in and of themselves, are definitive, but there's some things that people will point to. You'll see that they're called Latinisms. If we remember that Romans are going to speak Latin, not Greek, and so they'll argue that there are certain things in the book here of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, that reflect a Latin understanding. So, like Mark 12:42, a poor woman came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents, a few quadrantres. That's there. That's possible, but again, whether it would necessitate that it was written in Rome, it could be written anywhere with a large Gentile population throughout the Roman Empire, right? There's nothing that say it absolutely because it has to do with it. So it's circumstantial on that. The same thing with the mention of Simon of Cyrene's son. So at Mark 15:21, and they compelled a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Now, when we read Mark 15 there, it would assume that Alexander and Rufus are known to the people there. Okay? That's something. Alexander and Rufus are known people. Now, in the book of Romans, Paul writes, "Greet Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, and also his brother and mine, also his mother and mine." Again, circumstantial there. We have no clue, we have no evidence that there's not another Rufus. It's certainly possible. Could it be the same guy? Yes. Could it not be? Absolutely. There's just no way of knowing. So again, that's one of the difficulties with this. Again, they can say, well, the audience is a fairly Gentile audience, but again, that's in and of itself is not sufficient to tie it to Rome on that. Allusions to suffering, well, that's great, but again, the church has suffered throughout its history, so there's nothing in there that's going to say, yes, this is the kind of the nail in the coffin that's telling us it has to be in Rome, that Mark has to be writing from Rome. Now, one of the things that we do see that kind of points us this way is a little better, I think. 1 Peter 5:13 locates Mark in Rome with Peter in the early 60s. Okay? Now, this is significant because, again, Peter is thought to be the primary source behind the Gospel of Mark. But the reality is we don't have a full, detailed explanation of all of Peter's travels. So it is possible, very possible, that Mark could have been with Peter at other times that are not attested in the text. So it's very likely Mark Mark has been with Peter at some other times, and he just may happen to have done it there at Rome or potentially somewhere else. So there's no way of us really knowing, but a lot of people want to say, yeah, Rome makes probably about as good as anywhere else. Now, we know that we're dealing with a primarily Gentile audience, again, possibly at Rome. But before we get into the kind of the structure and what's going on in the book of Mark, there's two issues we have to deal with in the text. Okay. And the first one has to do with the very first verse of the Gospel of Mark. 1:1 we read, in the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Weou Theou, Son of God. And this one gets debated. Was this phrase, Son of God, original to the text itself, or was it added later? Now, here's the thing that we know. This is found in the majority of the earliest manuscripts, in the most significant manuscripts, and it certainly fits in line with Mark's Christology. The phrase that often gets thrown around here is, it looks like a later scribal addition. The problem is, it sort of fits. Like, this one isn't out there, and someone will say, well, it was missing in this manuscript, it was there, and this one seems to be, I think this was definitely what Mark wrote. He had this addition, this thing, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So I think that one's fine. But the other one that we have to deal with is the ending of Mark. Specifically, what do we do when we get to Mark 16:8? And then, how do we deal with verses 9 through 20? Now, if you look at yours, if you look at your version here, most modern translations they still have verses 9 through 20, but a lot of them will put brackets around it because they have this. We aren't sure that this is actually authentic, but it's the issue. So, what are the issues around this? So, the question is, does the Gospel of Mark, did the original Gospel of Mark end at verse 16:8, or did it continue on in verses 9 through 20? And here's what we go with. Okay? A lot of times, you'll hear people specifically who've grown up, or they've grown up with the King James, and it's always been there. And they will accuse people who debate verses 9 through 20 as deleting words from the Bible. Okay. Here's where we want to push back and say, whoa, that's not the question. The question for us is, when Mark wrote the gospel, when he was sitting there with his stylus and his ink and his thing, and he fits it, when he takes his pencil and puts it down, that's where the gospel stops, right? That is the autograph. That is the inspired word of God. Okay? We all agree on that. The question that we're asking is, did Mark put his pen down in verse 8, or did he then continue on into verse 20? Here's where we have the issue. The majority of manuscripts include a longer ending in verses 9 through 20. A majority do, okay? So that's there. We don't have to. If you were just counting manuscripts, yes, the majority do have it. The problem is, our two most important manuscripts for the Gospel of John, specifically Sinaiticus and Codex Bezae, those two do not have the additional verses 9 through 20. The longer ending is missing from these two very critical, very early manuscripts. And this is highlighting an issue here. When we talk about manuscripts, we don't want to just count the number. Because let's oversimplify this just to make the point. Okay, this is definitely an oversimplification. Imagine you have two manuscripts, A and B. This one is the original, and this one has been modified, okay? Again, just follow here. But imagine this one is the one that just gets copied the most. This one still gets copied. It just doesn't get copied as often. Okay? The sheer number of manuscripts itself is not a sufficient reason to believe that's what's original. We want the oldest and the best. And so Sinaiticus and Codex Bezae are two of our central ones for this. Now, one of the things that we do see is that the first church fathers, Jerome and Eusebius, both state that the best manuscripts, and they understood this at their time, the best manuscripts do not contain the longer ending. Okay? And you can look in there and say, well, there's some issues when we look at that longer ending. There's some non-Markan words. Okay? Now, if this were the only pushback, that'd be kind of hard, because statistically, you need about 10,000 words to tell what somebody's vocabulary would be. We have 11,300-ish of Mark. And it's certainly possible that the vocabulary in verses 9 through 20, because it's a new context after the resurrection, that could certainly explain the difference in vocabulary. So I'll be there. The other problem that we really deal with is that verses 9 does not naturally follow from verse 8. Look what happens. They went out, so this being the women, they went out and fled to the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Again, a relative pronoun, relative feminine plural pronoun. Verse 9, now after he had risen on the first day of the week, he appeared to Mary Magdalene. So we're shifting from the subject being the women using the relative pronoun they, to he, the relative pronoun he, masculine singular. That's a really sharp distinction, and it doesn't seem to flow very well. Additionally, Mary is introduced in verse 9, but she's not mentioned in verse 1. And verse 9 seems repetitive of verse 2. So, we're not going to make a huge deal of this. I just want you to know that if you're going to deal with the Gospel of Mark, you're going to have to deal with this issue. I do not think verses 9 through 20 are original to the original autographed manuscript for that Mark had when he placed down his pen. Okay? However, I'm also not going to make it an issue. Okay? I have friends on both sides of this. You just need to know that if you're going to deal with the Gospel of Mark, you're going to have to deal with this particular issue. So, there we go. And we'll talk about this specifically, because we have another specific one in the Gospels that we'll have to deal with. But right now, sufficient to the moments of the problems thereof. Now let's talk about the Gospel of Mark. Here's the issue. Mark gets shortchanged a lot. That's just the way this goes. Often Mark gets read through the lens of Matthew and Luke. Mark often doesn't get to have his say. He doesn't get to have his contribution. He often gets a shortchange here. And some people say, well, it's because Mark's shorter, he doesn't have theology. That's quite false. Mark has some good theology going on. He has a lot of contributions. Obviously, he's not as long as Matthew or Luke or John, but he does have his contributions to make. And so we don't want to shortchange him here. But as we look at it, let's talk about the structure of the Gospel of Mark. So we get an introduction here, 1 through 13. It's let's call it a prelude to ministry. Okay? Then we get two major sections. 1:14 to 8:30. We'll just call this ministry in Galilee. I'll send out a fuller breakdown. I'll post this online there. A fuller breakdown of the structure of the Gospel of Mark. We're just going to look at this in kind of sketch form here. And the second one is going to pick up here 8:30 to 16. We're going to stop at 8. And this is, we'll call the second section, to the cross. Okay? So these are two very unique sections. If you look here, the pace and the kind of the tone of these two sections is very different. One of the key things that highlights this section is this phrase. You'll see it sometimes with the and, some with the not. And immediately. And 1:14 to 8:30, Jesus is moving. He is blowing and going. You want to talk about somebody getting stuff done? It is Jesus. He's healing. He's healing. He's performing miracles. He's doing this. He's doing that. He's that. Bum, 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 bum. He's just moving. It is amazing how fast they're. If you are ADHD, this is your kind of reading. It is all about action. So, that's this first section. However, what happens, the center of Mark is Mark 8:27 through, let's say 38. Yeah, 8:27 through 38. Excuse me. So, from 1:1 all the way here, we've got this boom, boom. It's all go, 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 go. And at the center, the literal center of the Gospel of Mark, we get this, and this is what's we often refer to it colloquially as Peter's confession. Jesus comes to him and says, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, we want to understand this. We understand this event in the context of the Gospel of Mark. Don't read it in light of Matthew or in light of Luke. Read it in light of the Gospel of Mark. What is happening here in the Gospel of Mark? And so, Peter's confession stands here in the middle. He says, "But who do you say I am?" Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, you are the Christ," and he warned him to tell no one about it. Okay, that's cool. Peter's confession, beautiful, beautiful. But verse 31, "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes and be killed and 3 days later rise again." So then we get Peter's confession of the Christ, and then we get an explanation from Jesus about what it means to be the Christ, and center to that is going to be the cross. And from this moment on, when Jesus begins to tell them what it is for him to be the Christ, it is a long, slow march to Calvary. If we want to think about this chronologically, this could take anywhere from 2 to 2.5 years, potentially even 3, depending on your dating. This whole second half of the gospel could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, even less. Mark's whole gospel, boom, 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 boom. Lots of stuff happening, but this is over a long period of time. Long, slow march to the cross. And he does that, and he's showing, central to who he understands is and what he's doing, is this call not only for him to be the Christ and to be the one. Here's the kind of Christ that I am. It's ultimately going to recall his believers to follow after him. So, again, I'll post the fuller breakdown of Mark's Gospel there online so you can see it. It'll be under those course documents. And so Mark's Gospel has a very up and down, right? Center to it is the cross. Now, let's back up and let's talk about some themes. What are some contributions, some key themes in the Gospel of Mark? Obviously, one of the things that sets Mark apart is, again, this use of the idea of immediately and immediately and immediately. But one of the key contributions that Mark gives us is this theme of suffering. Central, again, right there at the center of Mark's Gospel, he tells us, he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes and be killed and 3 days later rise again. Suffering, the Christ suffering, is going to be central for Mark's gospel. And that's not that none of the other gospels teach that. They absolutely do. But suffering plays a unique role because suffering, again, think about how Mark has structured his gospel. It all leads up to this moment. Jesus explains the suffering, and now he's going to show it. And that's where we're heading. So suffering as a key theme here. But the second one, right on its heels, is discipleship. And this, again, gets tied together in Peter's confession. Jesus tells them that, hey, look, I'm going to be suffering. Peter comes up and says, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. What is Jesus' response? Get behind me, Satan. You don't have your heart set on the things of God, but on the things of men. And so he summoned the crowds and disciples and said to them, all right, here's discipleship. If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So for Jesus to be a suffering servant and a suffering Christ is going to mean for his disciples to be a suffering people. And that's central to what Mark is getting at here. It's not an ancillary thing. It's going to be central for Mark's understanding of who we are to be as a people. Okay? So, suffering and discipleship go hand in hand. One last thing that we want to see is what's often referred to as the messianic secret. Now, we want to take a little bit of a different approach to this. This term was originally coined by William Vrede in 1901. And he says, basically, if you look through the Gospel of Mark specifically, all these places where Jesus tells them not to tell people who he is, the reason that he had to do this is because, well, you have to explain how they came to believe this Jesus was the Christ when he was looking for the coming of there, and he hasn't done it. And so it was a messianic secret. William Vrede goes down that road a good way. However, there is a real sense in which there's a messianic secret because at key points, Jesus does things and then he tells them, don't tell. And it plays again, this is where it's not that it's absent from Matthew and Luke, but it's a key and unique feature in Mark that's in the way it's just not in the others. And the question is, okay, why would Jesus, if these people see who he is, tell them, don't tell anybody? And the answer that we come to is he's telling them not to tell anyone because they have a different understanding of what it means for him to be the Messiah. You see this in Peter's confession of Christ. He confesses, you are the Christ, but the Christ he has in mind is not one who suffers. And so when Jesus tells him what kind of Christ he is, now Peter doesn't like that, and Peter's torn up about it. And so one of the big thing for the messianic secret here is what we understand is he does not let them tell because he is going to make sure that he defines his messianic vision and his messianic purposes on his own terms. He's not going to let the others do it. So, some key themes there, again, suffering, discipleship, and the messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark. And Mark, again, giving us a unique picture that we don't want to overlook. We don't want to discount it. We want to take it for what he has given us and do it. So, there you go, the Gospel of Mark in a nutshell.